The woman in the blue hoodie. The cold wind rushed past as a woman stepped out of a black rideshare vehicle and stood quietly outside the sparkling glass doors of Silverstone Motors, a luxury car dealership in downtown Atlanta. She looked ordinary, blue hoodie, black jeans, running shoes, no makeup, no jewelry. Her hair was tied in a simple bun, and a worn canvas bag hung over her shoulder. To the casual observer, she could have been anyone: a mother, a teacher, maybe someone looking to buy her first used car. But she wasn't just anyone. Her name was Amara Jacobs, and she was the owner of Silverstone Motors. The dealership was one of 5 she had purchased over the last 7 years, a part of the Amara Auto Group, which she had built from scratch using savings, sacrifices, and sleepless nights. And this dealership, the one she now stood outside of, had been giving her nightmares. Over the past 6 weeks, she had received 3 anonymous emails. Each one described an uncomfortable truth: your staff treats black customers differently. I wore a hoodie and was ignored. I came back in a suit and was offered champagne. They assume we can't afford anything. They humiliate us. At first, she wanted to believe it was a mistake, a misunderstanding. Maybe one employee with a bad attitude. Maybe someone having a rough day. But the stories kept coming, so Amara made a decision. She wouldn't send an assistant. She wouldn't call ahead. She wouldn't show up in her usual power suit, heels, and custom-tailored coat. No one would recognize her today. She was going to walk into her own dealership as a stranger and see the truth for herself. Inside, the showroom sparkled like a jewelry box. The walls gleamed with glass and chrome. Sleek Bentleys, Mercedes-Benz AMGs, and new electric Porsches were parked like artwork on polished marble tiles. Classical music played softly from hidden speakers. Everything was designed to say one word: elite. But as Amara opened the door and stepped inside, something hit her like a wall. Silence. Not the peaceful kind. The heavy kind. The awkward kind. A receptionist with flawless makeup glanced up from her phone and looked away. 3 salesmen, all in tailored suits, leaned over a couple discussing a new Range Rover, laughing like old friends. Another salesperson, a tall, heavy-set man in a blue vest, noticed her immediately. He frowned. His eyes scanned her from head to toe, and then nothing. Amara walked further in. She paused near a beautiful black Lexus. Still no greeting, no offer of help, no smile. She approached the receptionist, a young woman with perfect blonde curls and a name tag that read Tiffany. "Hi," Amara said, softly but clearly. "I'd like to look at the sit-ins." Tiffany didn't smile. Her voice was sharp, cold. "We don't have any used vehicles under $30,000, she said flatly. Amara blinked. "I didn't ask for used cars." Tiffany paused, slowly chewing her gum. Then she added, "You can check online. Appointments are required for test drives." Amara stayed calm. She didn't expect red carpets, but she expected basic human decency. "I'd still like to look around," she said. Tiffany shrugged. "Suit yourself." As Amara walked further into the showroom, she saw the tall salesman whispering to another staff member, laughing behind. A raised hand, she reached a metallic gray Mercedes Maybach and gently ran her fingers along the edge of the hood. It was sleek, beautiful. Then she heard it. "Excuse me, ma'am. I'm going to have to ask you to not touch the vehicles unless you're accompanied by a rep." It was the man in the blue vest. He walked toward her with heavy steps, arms folded. "You a customer?" he asked, his tone condescending. "Or are you just browsing?" Amara tilted her head. "Isn't that the same thing in a car dealership?" He smirked. "Look, we get window shoppers in here all the time. But this isn't that kind of place. People don't just come in here unless they're serious, you understand?" He looked her up and down again. "This isn't a mall." Amara breathed in slowly. Her voice remained calm. "I see," she said. "And how do you usually decide who's serious?" The man didn't flinch. "Look, I'm not here to argue. But if you're not pre-approved or can't provide a credit pull, I suggest you visit one of our sister lots outside of town." He motioned toward the door. "Now please, let's not make a scene." Behind them, Tiffany was grinning like a Child watching a school fight. Customers looked over their shoulders. Curious, and Amara stood still, her face unreadable, but inside she was burning. Still. She wasn't done yet. Before I leave, she said slowly, "What's your name?" The man scoffed. "It's Ken, and I'm the assistant floor manager." "Thank you, Ken," she replied. "And your general manager?" "That would be Mr. Russell Gaines, but he's busy today." "I'm sure he is." Amara turned without another word and walked out the door. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. She didn't reveal who she was, but as she walked down the sidewalk, pulling out her phone, her fingers moved with sharp precision. First call, her executive assistant. Layla. Second call, her legal team. Third, her chief HR officer. Already briefed for emergency action plans because what Ken, Tiffany, and the others didn't know was this. In 24 hours, everything was about to change. He returned of the real Amara the next morning. The city of Atlanta was humming with its usual energy, but inside Silverstone Motors, something felt off. The staff had returned as they always did, polished, rehearsed, and ready to impress the next well-dressed millionaire who walked through the door. Ken, the assistant floor manager, stood by the espresso machine sipping a designer coffee, boasting loudly about a wild incident from the day before. He chuckled as he told a fellow salesperson how he had handled a suspicious woman who dared to touch a Maybach without asking. Tiffany added her part to the story, laughing as she mimicked the woman's attitude, saying she probably walked in off the street thinking it was a public museum. The entire thing had become a joke. What none of them realized, however, was that they hadn't just insulted a customer, they had insulted the owner of the company that signed their paychecks. At exactly 9:45 a.m., a sleek black Cadillac Escalade pulled into the VIP parking space in front of the showroom. The doors opened slowly, and a woman stepped out with a presence that changed the air around her. Amara Jacobs was dressed in a tailored navy blue suit that hugged her frame with power and grace. Her high heels clicked confidently across the marble tiles. Her diamond watch sparkled under the morning sun. Her hair was sleek, and her posture was regal. But what was even more powerful than her appearance was her expression, calm, quiet, and focused, with the chilling restraint of a storm just before it breaks. Her entrance wasn't loud or flashy, it didn't need to be. It was the kind of entrance that commanded attention without asking for it. Every eye in the showroom turned as she walked through the door. Tiffany looked up from the reception desk, about to give her a smile until recognition flickered in her eyes and her expression fell flat with horror. Ken, standing nearby, froze mid-sentence. His face drained of color as he blinked, trying to connect the dots between the casually dressed woman from yesterday and the confident powerhouse now walking straight toward the front desk. His mouth opened slightly, but he said nothing. Everyone had suddenly gone silent. Amara stopped in the middle of the showroom and slowly turned her head, looking over each employee one by one. She didn't speak at first. She didn't need to. Her eyes carried a message more powerful than words. Finally, she placed a small leather folder on the counter, opened it, and calmly slid her business card forward. It was the same card Ken had never seen. The same one she had considered dropping yesterday, but had chosen to keep until the right moment. And now that moment had arrived. "My name," she said, her voice even and firm, "is Amara Jacobs. I am the CEO of the Amara Auto Group and the owner of this dealership. All of this, every car, every desk, every light bulb you switch on in the morning belongs to me. I was here yesterday." You could hear a pin drop in the room. Ken's hand trembled as he tried to find something to say. Tiffany, who had moments earlier been mocking a customer, looked like she might faint. The other salespeople stood still, their eyes wide, their minds racing as they realized who they had insulted, ignored, and embarrassed just 24 hours earlier. But Amara wasn't here for apologies. She wasn't interested in excuses. She had come for accountability. Before anyone could utter a word, the side door opened again, and a man in a black suit rushed in. His name was Daniel Briggs, the regional director for the Southern Division of Amara Auto Group. He had flown in from Texas late last night after receiving Amara's call and had spent the entire flight reviewing security footage, phone logs, and customer reviews. Daniel was loyal, meticulous, and knew Amara's values like scripture. He also knew that when Amara said someone had crossed a line, that line was already far behind them. "Ma'am," Daniel said as he approached her, bowing his head slightly. "We're ready." Amara nodded and walked past the stunned staff, heading toward the main office with Daniel and her corporate legal counsel behind her. They entered the glass-walled conference room that overlooked the entire showroom. It was no longer just a dealership, it had become a stage. Employees watched from below, whispering nervously, trying to figure out what was happening, who was next, and whether they still had jobs. Ken tried to act. He straightened his vest, slicked back his hair, and marched toward the conference room as if he could explain it all away. He knocked once, then stepped inside. "Miss Jacobs," he began, his voice shaky. I didn't know. I had no idea it was you." Amara looked at him, and just that look made him stop. Her eyes didn't hold rage or drama, they held disappointment. "And somehow that was worse. And if it wasn't me?" she asked, her voice still soft. "Would you have treated anyone else the same way?" Ken's mouth moved, but no sound came out. "I don't run this company so people like you can judge customers based on clothes, cars, or skin color," she continued. "I'd built this business for families, professionals, students, artists, entrepreneurs, people who walk in here dreaming of something better. You made them feel small." "But Ken began, desperate. "You made me feel small," Amara added, cutting him off. "In my own business." Daniel stepped forward, his voice now the cold edge of corporate justice. "Mr. Kenneth Rollins, effective immediately, your employment with Silverstone Motors is terminated. You may collect your personal belongings under supervision and exit the premises within the hour. Legal and HR will be in contact." Ken's face collapsed. He looked around, hoping someone might defend him, but no one moved. Tiffany looked away, pretending not to see him. Other staff members turned their backs. He was suddenly alone in a room full of people. Amara didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She didn't say, "I told you so." She just turned to Daniel and gave a nod as Ken left the room. Dragging his steps like a man walking to his own funeral, Amara looked out over the showroom through the glass and saw something that made her heart sink all over again. A young woman, black, early 30s, in a tailored gray suit, stood near the same Lexus Amara had touched the day before. She was holding a folder with printed specs and bank documents, clearly ready to buy. And just like yesterday, not a single employee had approached her. Amara's voice rang through the room like a bell as she pointed out the window. The woman in gray. What's her name?" Daniel turned, then quickly sent someone from the corporate team to approach her. Within seconds, the woman was being respectfully greeted by a new employee who had just arrived with the transition team. Amara watched as the customer's posture changed, shoulders relaxing, a faint smile forming, then she stepped out of the room herself. "Excuse me," she said kindly, approaching the customer directly. "I just want to personally welcome you to Silverstone Motors. My name is Amara, and if there's anything we can do to make this visit better, please don't hesitate to let me know." The woman looked surprised, then smiled. "Actually, I was hoping to see the 2023 Lexus Hybrid. I think I'm ready to buy." Amara smiled back. "Let's make sure you're treated the way you deserve." Back inside the showroom, Tiffany knew her time was up. As Amara returned to the conference room, Daniel slid another termination notice across the table. The damage had already been done. The customers she had insulted over the past year might never come back. Amara didn't believe in punishment for mistakes, but she did believe in accountability for patterns. By the end of the day, 3 more employees had been suspended pending review. A special team from corporate had replaced the sales staff for the rest of the week. Amara personally signed off on a new training program that would be mandatory at every dealership, under her brand: empathy training, cultural sensitivity workshops, and quarterly anonymous mystery customer tests. No one would know who or when the test would come, but everyone would know why. because in Amara's business, success wasn't just about luxury cars or marble floors. It was about values, about dignity, about seeing the worth in every person who walked through those glass doors, whether they drove a Civic or a Rolls. That evening, Amara sat alone in her corner office, sipping a cup of mint tea as the sun dipped. Below the Atlanta skyline, the dealership was quiet now. The staff was gone, but she felt something shift, not anger, not revenge, just resolve. She looked at a framed photo on her desk, her grandmother, Pearl Jacobs, who used to sell used tires out of a garage behind her house. Pearl never owned a business, never drove a luxury car, never had polished shoes or boardrooms. But she taught Amara one truth that had built everything. Baby, Pearl once said, don't let the world forget kindness is free, but disrespect is expensive. And today, some people had learned just how high that cost could be. Whispers. In the system, the quiet inside Silverstone Motors didn't last long. In the following days, news began to ripple through the halls of the Amara Auto Group like a growing wave, soft, at first barely noticed, but gradually building momentum. First came the whispers from neighboring dealerships that the CEO had gone undercover, that a manager had been fired publicly, that corporate cleanup crews had moved in without warning. Then came the meetings. Regional directors were called in. Emergency Zoom calls were scheduled. HR officers were instructed to pull customer complaint records. The company's internal network, normally filled with dealership promotions and inventory reports, now buzzed with urgency. Everyone knew something had happened, something big, but few knew just how deep the roots of the problem had grown. Amara didn't sleep much that week. Her days were packed with back-to-back strategy meetings, legal briefings, and training reform sessions. But it was the nights that drained her, the quiet hours when she sat alone in her home office staring at old emails from customers who had quietly complained months, even years ago. She read them all now, not with corporate detachment, but with the heavy realization that she had been too distant, too trusting of the culture within her empire. She had built her brand on integrity and fairness, but somewhere between boardroom expansions and national growth campaigns, a toxic thread had slipped through unnoticed. And now she was pulling it out, inch by inch, determined to expose the whole thing. No matter how far it reached. It was during one of these long nights that an email popped into her inbox subject line. You don't know me, but I work for you. The message came from a woman named Chanel Rivera, a junior sales associate at one of Amara's dealerships in Charlotte, North Carolina. The email was long, hesitant in tone, but brave in its truth. Chanel explained that she had been following the news out of Atlanta and that she, too, had witnessed discrimination inside her location. She wasn't in a leadership position. She had no power. But she had seen things she could no longer stay silent about. Customers of color being passed over for test drives, sales leads being rerouted to preferred reps, older customers being charged extra for unnecessary services. The worst part, every time she tried to speak up, she was warned to know her place. She said she was scared of losing her job, scared of being branded a troublemaker. But more than fear, she was tired of watching her company become something it was never meant to be. Amara didn't hesitate. She responded within 5 minutes, thanking Chanel for her honesty and courage, and asked her to schedule a confidential video call the next morning. A call, which lasted nearly 2 hours, opened a door that Amara had only begun to knock on. Chanel was articulate, respectful, and careful in her words, but everything she described echoed the same pattern: subtle bias, masked exclusion, institutional arrogance. She gave names, dates, and even screenshots of text messages where a manager instructed staff to filter out time wasters by using coded phrases. It was no longer a question of isolated bad apples. It was a deeper illness in the cultural rot that had been allowed to grow because no one had thought it would ever be discovered. Amara thanked Chanel, assured her of full protection, and closed the call with a promise. Then she stood up from her desk, walked to the window, and stared out into the darkness. The city lights twinkled below her like fireflies, but her mind was already racing. She wasn't just dealing with one broken dealership anymore, she was facing a cancer that had quietly metastasized inside the very walls of the organization she had built from nothing. It was personal now, it had always been personal. And if she didn't act fast, everything she stood for would crumble not from outside attacks, but from betrayal within. The following day, Amara summoned her crisis integrity team, a small group she had formed during the early days of her company when she still had 5 employees and a dream. It was a team built on values, not positions, people she trusted more than titles, more than fancy resumes. There was Noah, a soft-spoken man in his 50s who had once been fired from another dealership for defending a teenage intern. There was Latasha, a former public defender turned compliance officer whose quiet fire made entire boardrooms sit up straight. And then there was Michael, her head of ethics, who used to be a journalist and had a nose for truth sharper than any lauer Amara had ever hired. Together, the 4 of them created a roadmap one that would shake every corner of the company. Their plan was bold: a complete, unannounced audit of all 15 dealerships under the Amara Auto Group brand. Every location would receive surprise visits. Not from consultants, not from flashy executives, but from trained ghost customers, people of all races, ages, and backgrounds. They would pose as regular buyers and record their experiences, down to the smallest detail. From how long it took to be greeted to whether employees followed the same protocol for every visitor, Amara wanted it all. The truth, raw and unfiltered. Within 72 hours, the mission was in motion. The results were devastating. Out of the 15 dealerships, 9 failed the ghost customer audit. Some failed miserably. In several locations, white customers received faster service, better financing options, and warmer greetings than customers of color. In one location, a woman in a wheelchair was left waiting for 20 minutes while able-bodied customers were escorted to the VIP lounge. In another, a same-sex couple was asked if they were just friends, and the worst? A Latino father and son were told they might feel more comfortable shopping at a different branch. After the father mentioned paying in cash, Amara sat in silence as the reports were read aloud. This was not just a bad day. This was not just one toxic manager in Atlanta. This was a broken mirror reflecting back everything she had vowed never to become. It was the kind of reflection that made you ashamed to look at your own brand logo. The kind that made you question where the line between business and humanity had blurred. She had once been a girl in borrowed shoes, standing outside car lots, dreaming of one day owning her own vehicle. Now she was a woman who owned 15 showrooms, and in some of them, that same little girl would still be turned away at the door. She made the decision that very night, every single dealership would be shut down for one full business day. Announced on short notice to the public, with signs on the glass reading, "We're not closed, we're changing. Today, we listen. Tomorrow we serve better." Amara took the heat. Social media exploded with questions. News outlets called it a scandal. Some customers were angry, others curious. But when Amara held a live press conference standing in front of her flagship dealership with Chanel Rivera at her side, something shifted in the public mood. She didn't cry. She didn't blame anyone else. She didn't spin stories. She told the truth. She told them what she had seen, what she had experienced, what her ghost customers had endured. She acknowledged the pain of every person who had been treated poorly under her brand. And then she made a promise not just to her customers, but to every employee watching. If you work in my company and think that success is only for those who dress like you, look like you, or worship like you pack your things, you don't belong here. But if you believe in the dignity of every human being who walks through our doors, if you believe that a mother in worn shoes deserves the same respect as a millionaire in Italian leather, then stay. We need you. That press conference went viral. Within 48 hours, Amara was on national morning shows. Celebrities reposted her speech. Civil rights groups reached out to collaborate. Her dealerships, once quiet in corners of southern cities, had become the front line for a larger movement. People didn't just want cars, they wanted fairness, respect, dignity, but not everyone was clapping behind closed doors. Some of her senior executives were uncomfortable. They feared backlash. They whispered about profits, shareholders, and bad optics. They said things like, "You're making us look weak," or "You're making this too political." Amara listened patiently. Then she made a list of names. And within a week, 5 high-ranking executives who had resisted the culture overhaul were replaced. No drama, no fanfare. Just the quiet reshaping of a company determined to return to its roots. Chanel Rivera was offered a promotion. She was now the lead of Amara's new Customer Respect Task Force. Her first task, assemble a team of people from underrepresented communities, including past customers who had complained, and build a policy guide that would define the new face of customer service at Amara Auto Group for the first time in months. Amara felt something she hadn't felt in a while. Hope, not because the problem was solved, not because everyone was on board, but because the change had begun, not in press releases or glossy ads, but in conversations, actions, and hard decisions. She still had a long road ahead. There were still lawsuits to manage, settlements to offer, training programs to build, but the tide had turned. And it had turned because one woman chose to walk into her own dealership as a nobody and came out a leader, the knife behind the smile as the winds of change swept across the Amara Auto Group. The company headquarters in downtown Atlanta transformed into a hive of focused energy and hard decisions. There were late-night calls with dealership managers, morning rollouts of new diversity initiatives, and company-wide digital memos that no longer read like formality, but like fire. Amara herself had turned into a force. She was no longer just a business leader, she was a symbol, and her every word now carried the weight of truth and urgency. Employees at all levels felt it. Some were inspired, awakened by the culture she was building. Others were nervous, uncertain how long they could hide behind smiles and suits now that the old walls were crumbling. Inside the newly formed Customer Respect Task Force, led by Chanel Rivera, meetings were emotional. People cried as they shared their experiences, some about customers they had witnessed being mistreated, others about the shame they felt for saying nothing. There were technicians who confessed to overhearing racist jokes in the back room. There were receptionists who admitted they had quietly observed the pattern but felt powerless to speak. And yet, through those confessions, something remarkable was happening. Honesty was becoming louder than fear. In a workplace once ruled by silence and code, people were beginning to speak freely. Amara often sat in those meetings, not at the head of the table, but in the circle, listening not as a CEO, but as a woman who had been judged more than once. For her skin, her voice, her gender, and her quiet power, but with every movement forward came the undercurrent of resistance. There were those who did not like what was happening. Those who whispered behind closed doors that Amara was overcorrecting, that she was turning the company into a social justice project, and that she was risking profits for politics. Among them, one voice stood louder than the rest, not in public, but in the shadows. His name was Victor Langston, Amara's chief operating officer and her most trusted lieutenant for over a decade. He was sharp, polished, and brilliant at logistics. He had helped Amara scale from 3 dealerships to 15. She had once described him as her right hand, a man whose instinct for business was only rivaled by his loyalty. But loyalty, like gold, is only valuable when it's pure, and Victor's had become tainted. What Amara didn't know, what she had not yet seen, was that Victor had been quietly pushing back against her reforms. In private meetings with regional directors, he was downplaying the urgency of the situation. He was telling managers to nod and agree, but to run things their way once the noise died down. He believed this storm would pass, that the media attention would fade, and that the company would return to its old rhythm once Amara tired of the public crusade. He was wrong. But worse than being wrong, he was actively trying to steer the ship back into the very iceberg they had hit. And it was only a matter of time before Amara discovered how deep the betrayal went. It started with a leak, a confidential training video, meant only for internal use, somehow made its way onto a conservative blog that criticized Amara's new policies. The video, which featured Chanel explaining inclusive customer service practices, was taken out of context. The blog twisted it into something radical, claiming Amara's company was discriminating against traditional buyers and prioritizing identity over experience. The headline read, "CEO turns luxury dealership into social experiment. Whistleblowers say white customers are being ignored." Within hours, the article went viral. News outlets picked it up. Talk shows debated it. Social media swarmed with both support and outrage. A boycott hashtag began to trend. Anonymous reviews flooded dealership pages, many from people who had never set foot in the buildings. And amid it all, Amara sat in her office, watching the chaos unfold across her screens, her heart thudding like a war drum. She wasn't afraid of critics. She had faced worse. But she was stunned by the leak, stunned because only a handful of executives had access to that video. She immediately called an emergency meeting with her executive team, demanding answers. She looked into the eyes of the people she trusted most, searching for signs. They all denied involvement, of course. Some with convincing innocence, others with the smoothness of practiced liars. Victor was among them, calm, controlled, even suggesting that the leak may have come from an intern or disgruntled assistant. He spoke like a leader, concerned for the company's image. He even offered to personally lead the investigation into the breach. Amara nodded, said nothing, and dismissed the team, but her gut didn't sit right. So she made a decision that would change everything. She called Maya, a young data analyst in the cybersecurity team who had helped build the company's secure platforms. Maya was shy, introverted, and preferred spreadsheets to politics. But Amara had learned that some of the most dangerous truths live quietly in the hands of quiet people. She asked Maya to run a private trace discreet off the record and away from corporate IT oversight. And what Maya uncovered within 24 hours made Amara's chest ache. The leak had come from Victor Langston's terminal, encrypted email, anonymous server. But the digital fingerprints were unmistakable. He had uploaded the video using an unregistered VPN, routed through a shell address tied to an old media account under a false name. It wasn't amateur work. It was planned, deliberate, surgical. Victor hadn't just leaked a video. He had tried to sabotage the heart of Amara's movement. To burn the bridge from within. Amara didn't cry. She didn't rage. Instead, she did what she had always done when the storm hit. Hardest. She got quiet, painfully quiet. She sat in her office alone for an hour, staring at Victor's name on the audit log, trying to piece together the why. Was it ego? Power? Did he feel threatened by the rising attention? Or had he simply never believed in her vision to begin with, only riding along because it served his own ladder? Whatever the reason, the truth was clear now. Her right hand had become the knife at her back, and that knife had cut deep. The next morning, she called Victor into her office. No lawyers. No board members. Just the two of them, like old times. He entered with the confidence of a man who thought he was still winning. He spoke before she did. "I've already scheduled a PR team to respond to the backlash," he said casually. "If we stay ahead of the narrative, we can kill this in the next cycle." Amara looked at him, eyes calm, fingers steepled beneath her chin. "And then what?" she asked softly. "We pretend it never happened?" Victor blinked, sensing the change in her tone. "Amara, this is business. We made a mistake with visibility. I'll take care of it." She reached slowly into her drawer and pulled out a manila folder. Inside were printouts, server logs, IP traces, timestamps. She slid the folder across the desk. He opened it, his face changed. In that moment, the mask fell. Amara stood up. "I built this company on sweat, sacrifice, and values, Victor. You were there, you saw it, you helped me build it. But somewhere along the way, you stopped believing in the reason why. And you tried to tear it down." Victor tried to speak, but she held up her hand. "No more. You leaked it. You fed the flames. You tried to turn the world against something good because you were afraid of change. She stepped aside and pointed to the door. You're done here. Victor didn't fight. His eyes, once full of confidence, now held only the bitterness of a man who had gambled everything and lost. He left without another word. And Amara stood in the silence, feeling not triumph, but heartbreak. Losing a trusted partner wasn't. Victory. It was the price of leadership. That afternoon, she addressed the company. Live. Unfiltered. She told them what had happened. She didn't name names, but she explained the betrayal. She told them that standing for justice meant being willing to be betrayed. That power would be tested. That truth would be challenged. But they would not back down. We do not lead for applause, she said. We lead for legacy. Across the country, employees watched. Customers watched. Partners watched. And one by one, people began to stand taller, speak louder, believe again. Because they had seen the fire, and the woman who refused to let it consume her. Amara Jacobs was not just rebuilding her company, she was reimagining what leadership could be, and the storm was far from over. The trial of a Name the Storm that had been brewing for weeks finally found its thunder when a legal envelope stamped in thick red ink arrived at Amara Jacobs' executive desk. It was early morning, the sun still climbing behind the Atlanta skyline. When her assistant Layla knocked on the glass door, her expression unreadable, the envelope trembling slightly in her hand. Amara took it calmly, sliced it open with her letter opener, and read through the formal pages with slow precision. She didn't blink, she didn't speak. But by the time she reached the last page, her hand had curled into a quiet, unseen fist. Beneath the desk, a former employee, Bradley K. Simmons, a regional sales coordinator recently let go during her integrity audit, filed a civil lawsuit. The claim, wrongful termination. But not just that. He was accusing Amara of discrimination, alleging that her sweeping changes had unfairly targeted white male employees and created a hostile and biased corporate culture. In a matter of hours, local news stations picked up the headline. It was juicy. It had all the hooks: a powerful black woman CEO, a dismissed white male employee, accusations of reverse discrimination, and a company already under the national spotlight. The headline read, "Empowerment or Prejudice?" Fired employee says, CEO's reforms went too far. It was meant to hurt, and it did. Not because there was truth in it, there wasn't, but because it cast doubt. And doubt, when whispered loudly enough, can rattle the faith of the strongest structures. Inside the company, some employees grew quiet. Anonymous message boards began to stir with fear and speculation. What if this ruins everything? One wrote, what if she gets dragged through court and loses the trust of the public? Another asked, for Amara, this wasn't about legal fees or PR management. It was about her name, her integrity, and the foundation of her entire empire. She gathered her legal team the next day. The room was tense, filled with smart, experienced lawyers in sleek suits. They reviewed the case file, read every accusation, and presented their options: settle quietly to avoid more public noise, or fight it in court and risk giving the story more oxygen. Amara listened, silent as stone, until they finished. Then she stood, walked to the window, and said in a voice that cut through the room like a blade, "If I settle, I'm admitting guilt. If I fight, I defend everyone who ever believed in me, so we fight." And fight she did. The courtroom was cold and clinical, but the weight inside it felt like history. Press cameras lined the building's steps. Bloggers and news outlets refreshed their feeds. Supporters stood outside with signs that read, "We believe Amara, and justice should look like all of us." Inside, the plaintiff Bradley Simmons sat, stiffly beside his attorney, a man with silver hair and a smirk that never quite left his face. Their strategy was obvious from the start: paint Amara as too aggressive, too political, too focused on race, and not enough on merit. They presented emails she had written about systemic bias, quotes from speeches where she said she was done tolerating prejudice, and training materials that emphasized inclusion. They twisted her leadership into something radical, framing her passion as bias, her strength as vendetta, but what they hadn't counted on was her voice. When Amara took the stand, the room fell into a hush. She sat with her back straight, her hands folded in her lap, and eyes that met every person without flinching. The opposing attorney began with charm-soft questions meant to disarm, but Amara didn't shrink. When asked why she had fired Simmons, she didn't hesitate. Because he created a culture of exclusion, she said, her voice steady. Because I reviewed recorded evidence, customer feedback, and testimony from colleagues who said he mocked black customers and laughed at accents. That's not leadership. That's disqualification. The attorney raised an eyebrow. So you made that decision based on his race? No, she replied calmly. I made it based on his behavior, which, ironically, he believes he should be protected from accountability for. That's not how responsibility works. Then came the harder question. Miss Jacobs, would you say that your reforms focused primarily on uplifting women and people of color? Amara took a breath. The court leaned in. Yes, she said, because they had been excluded for too long, but I didn't exclude anyone else. I just stopped pretending that excellence only wears one face, the courtroom murmured. The judge asked for silence. But the impact was already made. For the next 2 hours, Amara told her story, not the polished version, but the real one. She spoke about the girl who had cleaned cars with her mother behind a mechanic's garage. The woman who had been denied a business loan 3 times before starting her first dealership with saved tips and secondhand furniture. She shared how she had risen through the cracks of an industry that wasn't designed for her, and how every decision she made was born from one question: will this help someone be seen, heard, and respected? Her voice cracked only once when she spoke about her grandmother, Pearl, and the day she promised never to become powerful enough to forget her people. When the testimony ended, the silence in the room was electric. Outside the courthouse, supporters had multiplied. Even those who didn't know her story had come to believe it, because they saw something rare: truth, unshaken. Journalists asked for quotes. Amara didn't give sound bites. She simply said, "Let the facts speak." The jury deliberated for a day and a half. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous: not guilty of discrimination. Full clearance, defamation proven, case dismissed. The judge added that the plaintiff's claims were baseless and strategically misleading, and that the court recognized Amara Jacobs as a businesswoman of unquestionable integrity whose reforms reflected ethical leadership. The courtroom erupted. Amara didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply stood, shook hands with her lawyers, and walked outside to the awaiting cameras. She faced the flashing lights like a woman who had walked through fire and came out still whole. I didn't win for myself, she said. I won for every voice that's been silenced, for every customer who felt invisible, for every employee too afraid to speak. Let this be a message. Integrity is louder than accusation, and justice is not blind when you make her look you in the eye. Across the country, people clapped, not just for the verdict, but for the woman who refused to bend. That night, Amara returned to her office. She sat alone, lit only by the soft light of her desk lamp. On her desk lay the court order, her testimony notes, and a handwritten letter from a young girl named Kayla in Kansas City who had watched the trial online with her mother. It read, "Dear Miss Jacobs, I want to be like you one day. Not because you own car stores, but because you didn't let people break you. You stood tall. Thank you." Amara pressed the letter to her heart. That was the real victory, not headlines. Not applause, but planting strength inside a girl who was watching, just like she once had. Legacy over luxury. Weeks after the courtroom cleared her name, Amara Jacobs stood before a private gathering of her company's regional directors, leadership board, and frontline employees. They were seated in a large, open space and empty dealership showroom in downtown Atlanta, temporarily cleared of vehicles and transformed into a stage for what would be her most personal, most important speech yet. The walls were bare, the floor was polished. A simple wooden podium stood beneath a single spotlight, and the air was heavy with anticipation. These weren't shareholders. They weren't media representatives. They were her people, the ones who kept the engines running, who shook hands with customers every day, who printed the documents, vacuumed the showrooms, and delivered cars to first-time buyers with proud smiles. These were the people whose faces weren't on the magazine covers, but whose work was the heartbeat of Amara's empire. She stood before them, not in a power suit or high heels, but in simple slacks, a long-sleeved blouse, and flats. Her hair was tied back, her jewelry minimal. There was no presentation behind her, no screens, no slogans, just her voice and the truth it carried. She paused for a moment, looking across the room, seeing every expression, every questioning eye. Then she began. "There was a time," she said, "when all I wanted was one car lot. Just one. A place with my name on the window and a chance to prove that someone like me, a black woman, could build something honest and lasting." She exhaled softly, but her words never wavered. But dreams grow. And as they grow, they stretch. They invite others in. They make room for more people, more ideas, more responsibility. And somewhere along that journey, we must ask ourselves, are we building something that just looks good or something that actually does good? There were nods across the room, quiet, reflective. When I went undercover at one of my own dealerships, I didn't do it to play a game. I did it because I heard whispers. Not from critics, but from customers, people whose stories weren't loud but carried pain. I wanted to believe it was a misunderstanding, that my our staff would never judge someone based on their race, their clothes, or the car they drove. But what I saw broke something inside me. She stepped from behind the podium and began walking slowly across the showroom, her voice lowering but growing more powerful with every step. We had a culture problem. Not just in one dealership, not just in one city, across the company. And when that truth came out, people asked me if I was ashamed. She paused. I wasn't ashamed of the truth. I was ashamed that I hadn't seen it sooner. There was silence, but the kind that pulls people closer, not away. I've spent the last few weeks thinking not just about our business, but about our purpose. Why do we exist? Is it just to sell luxury cars? Or is it to deliver something bigger: respect, fairness, dignity? Then, with the eyes of her company upon her, she made a decision that stunned even her closest advisors. Today I'm announcing a change, not a press release, not a slogan. A structural change. The Amara Auto Group will become the first major automotive company in the U.S. to adopt a dignity-first customer policy and enshrine it into corporate law. She waited as the murmurs rose. Some people leaned in, others blinked in disbelief. This means every dealership we own will now be legally obligated, not just ethically encouraged, to serve every customer without bias. Every interaction will be reviewed quarterly by an independent ethics board. Every employee, from regional managers to receptionists, will undergo rotating evaluations from real mystery, customers of all backgrounds. Promotions will no longer be tied solely to sales, but to empathy scores, peer reviews, and community impact. The room was stunned, but she wasn't done. I'm also establishing a new fund, a $10 million Justice Fund, to provide scholarships and seed money for young entrepreneurs from underserved communities who dream of one day owning a business like this. Not in my name, but in theirs. In memory of my grandmother, Pearl Jacobs, who once sold old tires for $5 a piece and told me, "Dignity isn't expensive, but it's the richest thing you'll ever give someone." A hush fell over the room, followed by a sound Amara never expected: tears. Grown men wiping their eyes, women holding their hands to their chests. Young employees who had never even spoken to Amara before were now seeing her not as a CEO, but as a reflection of what they could become. And then, without warning, Chanel Rivera, now the director of the Customer Respect Task Force, stood and clapped. It started slow, one pair of hands, then two. Then a wave. It wasn't applause for a boss. It was a salute to a leader. The next morning, news of Amara's new model went national. Business magazines tried to fit it into categories: revolutionary HR, next-gen leadership, the new face of corporate social ethics. But none of them fully captured what it truly was. It wasn't just policy. It was transformation. And it sparked something beyond the Amara Auto Group. Other companies began reaching out. Airlines, banks, tech startups, asking how did she do it. Universities invited Amara to speak on ethics and entrepreneurship. Young black girls mailed letters with drawings of car dealerships and captions that read, "This is mine one day." A woman in Chicago sent a photo of her father, a retired mechanic, standing in front of a newly purchased Lexus with a note. He said he's never been treated so human in a dealership. Thank you for seeing him. But perhaps the greatest moment came not in a conference room or courtroom, but in a quiet parking lot. Amara had stopped by her original, very first dealership, the one she had bought with personal loans and local faith, and was walking back to her car when she saw a young man with a baby stroller, trying to load a brand new car seat into the back of a modest used Hyundai. He was struggling, nervous, clearly feeling out of place. Amara approached gently, offered to help, and they worked together to get it fastened. As she turned to leave, the man looked at her, clearly not recognizing who she was, and said, "I've never bought from a place like this before." "They treated me like I mattered," Amara smiled. "You do." He smiled back. "You work here?" She paused, then nodded. "Something like that." She got into her car and drove off, not in Escalade, not in a Mercedes, but in her grandmother's old rebuilt Honda Civic, the same one that reminded her where she came from, the same one she had driven during her undercover visit. And as the city lights shimmered in the distance, she felt something settle inside her, not pride, not power, but peace. Because leadership wasn't about titles or wealth. It was about legacy. And hers had just begun.